Well, time for another episode of Survival Stuff with Indiana Jim. I am James C. Jones. I do live in Indiana, but Indiana Jones was taken. I am here on behalf of Live Free USA, America's oldest survival and preparedness organization. We are a nonprofit tax-deductible organization supported only by your memberships and your contributions and maybe your sponsorships if you're out there. We would appreciate your support. Our members get this newsletter, American Survivor, which is the oldest survival publication in the country. They get this newsletter either by snail mail or by email every 2 months. And we'll talk a little bit about that. Today, I haven't been doing these for quite a while, about a year. A lot has happened since the last time I did one of these survival stuff videos. Basically, at this point in time, we are in the post-pandemic, pre-war epoch, okay? In other words, the effects of the pandemic are still going away, they're still there, but we are now in a pre-war or even in the beginning of a war situation. And if you don't believe that, I'm going to fill you in on a few things, but listen up, this is not a drill. We are about to enter a third world war. We are already in those effects of the Third World War, and they're going to get worse and they're going to multiply. And there's going to be a number of scenarios how that can happen. But a lot of the material that I'll talk about today is from a new book that I've written. And this should tell you something about how the world is thinking and where we're at this point in time. A year and a half ago, for one thing, before I wrote the last book, I was writing books about emergency preparedness for disasters and natural disasters and all the other kind of things that were happening, crime and urban survival and back to basics and alternate living and all those kind of nice things, which were important and still are. But about a year and a half ago, I started to realize that the war was on the horizon. I've been around since 1941, believe it or not. Yeah, you're probably looking at me and saying, yeah, he has been around since 1941. So I actually have some memories of World War II and the effects of World War II and a lot of information about the Cold War and how we responded and what the situations were during those times. I'll probably say this again, but this new war is not your grandfather's war. Everything has changed dramatically and much more dangerous. We formed our organization, Live Free USA, back in the 60s when we were concerned mainly about the Cold War. We were concerned mainly about the nuclear war, even though the MAD and mutual assured destruction was kind of holding things in balance. Those things no longer apply. Those balances and checks no longer apply. We're in a much more dangerous situation than we were back in 60, 67, 68, 69, when it was just us in the Soviet Union in the possible scenario of a nuclear war exchange. So anyhow, as I would get back to what I was saying, about a year and a half ago, I started to work on a book about war survival and how we apply some of the other survival principles and techniques, but in a war situation. So then about a year ago, I proposed to my publishing house that we should write a book, or I would write a book, about how to survive what I said was World War III. They didn't like the World War III thing. So my alternate title was How to Survive the Coming War. Well, I was wondering whether they'd even want to touch that kind of subject, and this is a little over a year ago. And they had a meeting in New York at their publishing committee, or whatever you want to call it, and they came back immediately, for the first time I've ever had that happen. They came back within days and said, yes, we want that book. We want you to work on that book. Of course, having had experience with 5 other books, I had already written 5 or 6 chapters of the book and had roughed out several other chapters, because I found that when they hit you with that deadline, it's really hard if you're doing other things, which I am always doing other things. So at any rate, they liked the whole idea, and they wanted the book to be called Surviving the Coming War, and it is coming out in October. It was originally supposed to come out in January of 2025, but current events and ongoing situations that we have basically had them accelerate my publishing date, so it's going to come out in October. So I'm going to talk a little bit about those things. I'm not trying to sell the book, although I think really the more Americans that have the book, the stronger we'll be, and the more our enemies may take pause and think, well, you know, the Americans may resist, the Americans may be catching on to what we're doing, and maybe we better pull back a little bit. But otherwise, it looks like, very much like, we're going to have to know the knowledge, have the knowledge, and do the things that I advocate in my book. But let me talk about that for a few minutes. Like I said, I was born back in 1941, and all of my whole life, I've never seen a period where there was peace. There's always been multiple wars going on. I remember specifically as a child, maybe 4, 5, 6 years old, and I have a really good memory going back. We went to a movie with I went to a movie with my parents, and during the movie they used to have newsreels because you couldn't turn on your TV and see all the things that were happening. And it was a newsreel, and there was all kinds of people shooting at each other and throwing grenades and all that kind of stuff. And we came back out, and I remember asking, I know why I remember this. I asked my mother, I said, what was that all about? And she said, oh, that's the war in Palestine. So what does that tell you? This is back to my childhood, the war in Palestine. So I have to come to the unfortunate conclusion that war, not peace, is the normal state of mankind. And people want to be in denial. They want to try to ignore the need to have the kind of training and the kind of preparedness they would have for war. That's going to be very dangerous to have that kind of denial and not to do what you have to do. Back during the World War II and most of the Cold War, we had two oceans that insulated us from attack. Yes, we had, I recently wrote an article on the old civil defense with the Nike bases and things like that for bombers and missiles that might come over here. But generally, we were fairly immune to most of the kinds of things that war would bring to our homeland. We had the two oceans, and we were the mightiest industrial power in the world. And during World War II, we supplied not only ourselves, but we supplied the whole world with weapons and equipment. Well, that's all gone. We are now a very weak industrial power. China makes 99% of all the steel in the world. China makes about 50% of all the products in the world. They can make 10 ships while we make 1 ship because we shut down our own shipyards. We basically have destroyed ourselves with China using the rules established by the Chinese military writer Sun Tzu. And he, in the book, said you win the war before the battle is started. And if you're really good at this, you win the war without ever firing a shot. And that is exactly what is happening now. They're preparing for war. We talk about invading Taiwan and all that. They may or may not need to do that because they are destroying America from within. Now, if you don't believe that we're in bad shape, drive around any of our major cities. I live close to Gary, Indiana, and close to Chicago. You'll see all the ruined steel mills, or sometimes the ground is all gone, because it's been leveled because this stuff has been torn down. They have destroyed our industry just as effectively as we destroyed Germany's industrial base and Japan's industrial base with thousands of tons of bombs. They did it through economic warfare and psychological warfare, and they brought us to this state. So now they're ready to finish us off, and we are very weak. We are in the same situation that Japan was when they started war with the United States. In other words, Japan had a very weak industrial capacity compared to America. We could outbuild them, we could outbuild ships, we could outbuild tanks, we could overwhelm them. And by the way, historically, the strongest manufacturing economy always wins the wars. So we're in a very bad situation. And we have to realize that. We have to get a grip on it. We have to stop worrying about all these little local and domestic issues, because we've got a much bigger issue in Japan, or not Japan, but China and Russia and some of their vassal states or allied states like North Korea, Iran. They can distract us, have us fighting in 3 different directions, and then they can do whatever they want. And we could very well lose World War III. We are losing it already. There's economic warfare, basically what they call non-symmetrical warfare. In other words, their army is not going to fight our army, their navy is not necessarily going to fight our navy, but we have to be able to handle that. Of course, our navy and our army have to be able to fight that kind of war. But they have been fighting a non-symmetrical war against us for decades and decades. They're not fighting against our army, they're fighting against our economy. They're fighting against our morale. They're fighting against our unity. They're fighting against our internet systems and our technology. They're fighting against all of those things. They're corrupting our people. They're stealing millions and billions of dollars through their criminal organizations that they sponsor, that steal our money through various websites and various front organizations. Just an example, I have a friend whose husband passed away recently. He was actually one of our founding members, and the widow had her bank account drained dry, and she's dying of cancer. Her bank account was drained dry, and when she went to her bank to find out what happened, they said it was the Chinese hackers got and drained her money out of her account. A widow who's dying of cancer. This isn't happening just one place. I get the report from our local police. This is a very small, fairly small community. Every week there's a scam, and some older couple usually, or sometimes a company, gets scammed out of millions and millions of dollars. This is money that's sucked out of our economy, sent to China or Russia or our enemies, where they can build their ships, they can build their weapons, and we lose that money. So our infrastructure and our military don't have that money to work with. They have the money. When you buy things that are made in China, that money goes right into their military buildup and their attacks on America. So we're at war right now. Every time you turn on your computer, every time you look at your cell phone, you're in a combat zone. And since we're talking about that, one of the things I had to do with my book, because it's such a vast subject, war, okay, war, survival, it's a big subject, break it down a little bit. So one of the things I broke it down into is what kind of states you might have to survive in. Now there's 3 states. Basically there's wartime, war zone, and combat zone. Now, wartime is like my parents had to live through during World War II. There was rationing, there was all kinds of regulations, there was block captains and air raid sirens and all those kind of things. There was the black market was out there, those kind of things. They tried to regulate the economy. But it wasn't too easy back then because we didn't have credit cards. We weren't all plugged into some system. So I still have in fact, a picture in my book. They had little coupons that they could go for gas, for sugar, for meat. You had these coupons, and you had only so many coupons. Of course, that was black market going on, and I talk about how that will come back during wartime. So even if the war doesn't come to our doorstep, if the war stays in Europe, the war stays in Asia, it will have drastic effects on our economy, on our lifestyle, on our freedoms. So I deal with that in my book. Then there's war zone. Now, war zone, Israel has lived in a war zone for decades, where missiles come over from time to time. There's terrorist attacks fairly regularly. The air raids go off, sirens go off once in a while, things get blown up. The people live in a kind of a state of fear, but they go on with their natural lives, and things are somewhat normal. But war zone, basically, also that behind the lines in the Ukraine, in Kiev, that's a war zone. It's not combat zone because there's no one running down the streets. There's no tanks going down the street, and no troops going down the street shooting at each other. But They have to live with the possibility that a missile may come through, a drone may hit someplace, their water system may be hit, their power system may be knocked out, their hospitals may be knocked out. A very difficult and challenging survival situation for people that live in a war zone. And then there is combat zone. And combat zone is where actually, as I mentioned, where there's actually soldiers, they may be surrogates, they may be guerrillas, they may be surrogate groups that are disguised as domestic, but they're working on behalf of the enemy, where you're in a combat zone. So in my book, I deal with all three of those, war zone, combat, wartime, war zone, and combat zone. A war zone is something that we really have to deal with this time because I said, back in the day, we had the two oceans to separate us, and the only possibility was either big nuclear war where everything's blown up or relative peace, okay? That's not the case because we've got drones now, we have hypersonic missiles, basically missiles with explosive warheads, biological warfare warheads, all kinds of drones can do all kinds of very specific types of drones. They can reach here, launched from ships, so we may have what is called a conventional war. In other words, we may be in a conventional war zone where our power plant gets hit by a drone that was launched off the coast, or our electric generating facilities are knocked out by a multi-headed cruise missile that didn't carry any nuclear warheads but took out specific targets, and sometimes they're not that accurate and they may land in your neighborhood as well, but definitely going to be very, very damaging. They may knock out a key bridge. I live in an area where there's very important expressways going through here. They can knock out some of those and destroy our infrastructure fairly effectively, even if nuclear weapons don't get involved. And of course, in my book, I do like 40 pages of nuclear war survival because that kind of war may be conventional at the beginning, and I think we'll go to at least that, conventional warfare where things are happening here, where they're hitting us here. They'll also, of course, hit us by they can knock out our power through cyber warfare. They can knock out your water, they can knock out your power, they can knock out your hospital, they can knock out a whole lot of things. But through cyber attack, that'll be probably the first thing they do. Cyber attack, and they hit the satellites as well. So now your GPS doesn't work, your cell phone doesn't work. All those systems go down pretty much permanently. So this is what we got to look out for, even if you don't have troops in the streets, so to speak. So these are the kind of things that we're looking at. Now, we could lose this war. We have to be cognizant of the fact that we might be able to have to lose this war. I covered, by the way, in my book, subjects such as resistance, subjects such as civilian combat skills, because we may actually have some kind of occupation in our country. Now, again, I like to break things down into three. I don't know why. I'm just three. It's usually a good number. We cannot be occupied in three ways. America can be occupied by military occupation, which is the traditional what we think of as being occupied. In other words, there's Chinese or Russian troops in our streets, in our towns, in our town halls, in the capital, occupying our country. I kind of doubt that's the way things are going to go because it's very expensive and very difficult even for big powers to occupy a country the size of the United States. Russia occupied a number of Eastern European countries for decades, and it was extremely expensive, and it failed because that's exactly where the revolution started that actually took down the whole Soviet Union. And I have friends who are Russians, yes, I had friends who were Russians, who went over and visited their relatives in Russia, and they would tell you when their troops, their sons and fathers and, husbands went over to occupy Poland and Czechoslovakia, lots of times they had a high accident rate. They didn't come back because if they walked the streets at night, bad things would happen to them. So resistance was constant. It's very difficult to maintain military occupation. It might be temporary or it might be some regional things, but I sort of doubt that we'll have military occupation. But there are other two kinds of occupation. Domestic occupation. So let's say we have a war and at the end of it there's a peace treaty or a ceasefire or some other kind of agreement. We don't like the word surrender because our politicians would not like to get involved with the word surrender, but they could surrender even though they put it into different words and make it look different and change the narrative. Surrender is surrender, okay? Domestic occupation could be accomplished when a foreign power occupies it by installing authorities and installing people into the government and systems into the government through front groups, through corrupting the political parties that exist already. Like Abraham Lincoln stated that a country divided against itself cannot stand. In communist, this is traditional communist method of occupation. Divide the country into different elements so they're fighting each other instead of fighting you. And instead of fighting for freedom, they're fighting each other. They're turning on each other instead of to each other, kind of like we did with COVID, where we turned on each other when we should have turned to each other. So, domestic occupation. So we may very well see kind of domestic occupation, maybe under the table, maybe hard to recognize in some cases, but domestic occupation where certain forces and certain groups suddenly take control of our government, take control of our institutions, institute laws and regulations and systems that are anti-freedom, anti-self-reliance, anti-American in essence, but more digestible for the politicians and for the public. And I'm afraid that might be what we would see at the end of the coming war. The third form of occupation is something I kind of invented, and I like to think I was the first one to recognize it, is technological occupation. In other words, there are no institutions that come over and are formed, no recognizable change in government. Again, maybe we even think we won the war. But in the agreements, under the table, whatever it happens, foreign powers now have access to our surveillance systems, our legal systems, our health systems, our economic systems, our industrial systems, our military systems. All of the technology that is now all interlinked, and we're all dependent on, and they're already infiltrating those systems, our whole power and the grid, and some of our military, they're already infiltrating those systems. We don't know to what extent, but they'll obviously we'll find out when the war finally starts in earnest. So that would be technological occupation, where the enemy would have the controls of our country and ourselves without ever putting one soldier on our soil and without ever recognizing that, hey, those guys that are running the government are now running it on behalf of the enemy, because they're running it from China, or most likely China more than Russia. So technological occupation is a real possibility that we have to prepare for, and I cover that in my book. So, surviving World War III, or surviving the coming war, what do we have to do? What are the things that we have to prepare for? We have to take every element of survival that we already used and already learned about through some of my other books, like this one, and Total Survival. These cover all kinds of disaster survival and self-defense and all those kind of things, and what you need to put away and all the supplies you need and the skills you need. You have to take that and multiply it by 10 for surviving under wartime conditions. So in my book, I cover a lot of critical situations. I cover a lot of critical subjects related to war. For instance, evacuation. Evacuation under war conditions would be vastly different, vastly more difficult than it would be surviving and evacuating from a hurricane or a flood or some other natural disaster. Whole different scenario, whole different problems, and different kind of survival pack too, different kind of evacuation pack for surviving under wartime conditions. I talk about hard times and hazards. War time, those kind of things where we would have a much greater control. They could basically control everything you buy, everything you do, because we're now hooked up to the web, okay? So web, you're not the spider, you're the fly, okay? Bombs, missiles, and drones, and I cover specifically the brand new, it was brought up that drones and AI technology has changed warfare as much as the invention of gunpowder. Totally different things. You have totally different remote control, lethal autonomous weapon systems will be used. The things that can land and be programmed to kill certain people or blow up certain targets, either walking, crawling, swimming, or flying. But they're autonomous. They have just been told, go kill military people, go kill political people, go blow up this or that. That's a whole big element that's going to be in the coming war. Escape and evasion, we never had to cover that in my other books because we were talking about disasters, escape and evasion. Now we have to talk about escape and evasion. By the way, back in the 60s, in the possible Red Dawn scenario and the nuclear war scenario, we talked a lot about combat. We talked a lot about escape and evasion, safe movement, combat movement. Yep, we have to get back to that kind of training. We have to get back to that almost paramilitary, and I don't like to use the term paramilitary because we're not giving people ranks and all that. We're just teaching them military skills. But you're going to need military skills because you're going to be in a war zone or maybe even a combat zone. So, wartime first aid. I have a whole section on first aid, focusing on trauma, because you see the people being dug out of the rubble and the injuries that you're seeing in Gaza and in Ukraine to the civilians. We need to up our first aid skills considerably. And on the same note, I have a chapter on rescue, self-rescue, and being able to rescue people and help people get out of the rubble of buildings that those drones and those hypersonic cruise missiles, maybe they didn't have a nuclear warhead, but they still blew up the building that you're in, or the building that your friends are in, or your neighbors. So I devoted substantial time to dealing with the skills of rescue. Planning and training, of course, a chapter on that. Wartime economy, big issue, because war is not, again, like a disaster. It doesn't happen and then you get better. It happens and it happens and happens and it gets bigger, bigger and bigger, and it spreads and spreads and spreads, and it's a long time survival situation. So you have to know how to cope with a war time or a combat zone or a war zone economy. What do you have to do? And I go back and look at World War II, I look at some of the other things, and then adapt them to modern times, which are totally different in many ways. But you can definitely plan on stocking up on trade barter stuff. You can look at a black market economy that will thrive. It thrived during World War II, but it can be much bigger. And the government, of course, much more control of what you can buy and what you can have. Hoarding may become illegal. Just the kind of things that I had to cover. And then resistance, I was kind of surprised. I was glad. My editor, again, this tells you where we're at in the world, that I don't think the publishers would have touched these subjects a year ago. Resistance in an occupied America. And I talk about the different kinds of resistance and what would justify those levels of resistance. No, I couldn't go into, very controversial subjects like sabotage and things like that. But I did cover resistance, and I gave some references to other books about resistance. Resistance would be extremely hard with cameras everywhere. By the way, 50% of all the cameras in the world are in China watching the Chinese people, and they are required to carry a cell phone with them at all times. It's illegal not to have your cell phone. That's the kind of thing they want to bring here, so they can control every single individual. I do cover briefly, obviously you can't cover all these things in a chapter, but I do cover basic unarmed combat skills, basic armed combat skills, military skills for civilians, and then of course I cover wartime survival gear and supplies. And I wrote a whole book not that long ago, I don't have a copy of it right here, on survival gear. I adapt this to like the everyday carry. There's everyday carry for wartime, everyday carry for war zone, and everyday carry for combat zone. So I cover those same subjects but adapted to a wartime situation. So we're in a lot of trouble. We're facing a much bigger challenge to survival than we did even 2, 3, 4 years ago. And we're back to the 60s situation with nuclear war looming on the horizon, but also conventional war here affecting you, affecting your family, affecting the safety of America, affecting our freedom. And it's basically up to you, you people out there, and your children and your friends to prepare and be able to get us through this period with our freedoms and our liberties and our country and our ideas that we have for what a country should be like and what freedom should be like. If we lose this war, by the way, there's a book that just came out, I've just been reading, The End of Everything. The fact that this book would come out, this is by a very astute historian. The End of Everything goes into how societies are completely destroyed. And this is going to be a war of cultural inhalation. So if we lose this war, your children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, they will not even remember what America was like. They will not remember what freedom was like, what liberty was like, because it'll be an AI-controlled, totalitarian, way beyond a 1984 scenario world that will never, ever again be free. So this is what we're up against, and this is what we have to face. So I hope you'll tune in when I do another one of these. I hope you'll join Live Free USA at AmericanSurvivor.org. That's the website is AmericanSurvivor.org. And when the book comes out, I'd like to see every American have this book and then start practicing for what is coming, surviving the coming war. So, till next time, this is Indiana Jim for Life and Freedom. Stay safe out there.